The Diary of Anne Frank, Act 2, guided close read with embedded audio.
Act 2, Scene 1. In the darkness, we hear Anne's voice, again reading from the diary.
The new act and scene beginning at this point signal a change in the time of the action. Look back at lines 1 through 10. How much time has passed since the end of Act 1? A little over a year. What does this suggest about the suspected thief who may have heard noise from the annex? If there was a thief, he or she has not revealed to the police that there was noise. Playwrights usually describe events in chronological order, the order which they occur in. Reread lines 123 through 141. How does this passage help the audience and readers understand the order of events? Pause while you think. The dates on the cakes are one indication that events are being described in chronological order. How do these events propel the story? Because sugar is still being rationed and Meep is still hoping for peace, readers know that the war continues. Remember that the story in a play is told mainly through dialogue, and that the words characters say and the way they say them reveal personality qualities we call character traits, such as kindness, humility, or fear. Reread lines 145 through 200 to determine character traits. What does the dialogue about cutting the cake reveal about Mrs. Frank? How about Mr. Frank and the Von Dons? Pause while you think. Mrs. Frank is fair-minded. Mrs. Frank divides things better. Mr. Frank is a peacemaker. You see what a little sugar cake does to us? Mr. Von Don is self-centered and has a temper. That's a lie. Mrs. Von Don is petty and defensive. Don't I always give everybody exactly the same? Don't I? Dialogue in a play sometimes establishes a conflict that provokes characters to make a decision. Reread lines 241 through 278 to analyze the conflict described in this scene. How does Peter explain the conflict? In lines 251 through 254, Peter explains that his father wants to sell the fur coat that his mother is crazy about. According to Mrs. Von Don, why is the coat so important to her? It was a gift from her father. What decision does Mr. Von Don make? He gives the coat to Miep to sell. Although words may have a similar dictionary definition, they can have different connotations, the feelings or ideas associated with them. Remember that irony is a special kind of contrast between appearance and reality. Reread lines 279 through 291. Compare Mr. Von Don's words here with his comment to Anne in lines 1271 to 1273 of Act 1. What is the impact of Von Don again using the word discussion rather than quarrel? Pause while you think about that. He wants to make the situation seem better than it is by avoiding using a word with a negative connotation. What is ironic about Mr. Von Don's use of the word selfish? It's really Mr. Von Don who's being selfish here, and not his wife. Dialogue can propel the action in a play, moving the plot forward. Sometimes dialogue increases tension and forces characters to make a decision. Reread lines 350 through 380 to identify important details in the plot. What problem does Mr. Crawler describe to the group? Pause while you think. An employee, Carl, wonders where Mr. Frank has gone and asks about the bookcase, and he wants a raise. Why is the bookcase important? It's hiding the door and the stairs to the upstairs rooms. How does this dialogue move the plot forward and provoke a decision? The tension is heightened as the residents wonder if their hiding place has been discovered. Mr. Frank will have to decide whether or not to pay Carl more and if this is blackmail. Remember that playwrights can reveal what characters are like through their speech, thoughts, and actions. Reread lines 500 through 546 to draw conclusions about the relationship between Peter and Anne. What does Peter do to show his concern for Anne? He brings Anne cake when he knows she is upset. What does he say to encourage her? He praises the way she's able to speak to the adults, clearly expressing her feelings. What does Peter think about Anne's presence in the annex? He deeply appreciates her being there. What is the impact of the incident on their relationship? It shows that the relationship between the two is changing. They are becoming friends and allies. A simile is a figure of speech that compares two unlike things and uses the words like or as. A metaphor is also a comparison between things that are basically unlike. However, unlike a simile, a metaphor does not contain the word like or as. Reread lines 638 through 657 to identify 3 similes and 1 metaphor. What comparisons does Anne make using simile? Pause while you think. She compares the sound of Mr. Von Don's hungry stomach to a bass fiddle, her stomach to a whistling flute, and the group's stomachs to an orchestra tuning up. What is the impact of these similes? They help readers imagine the sounds. What does Anne compare using a metaphor? Pause while you find that. She compares Mr. Crawler's ulcers with the family. What does the metaphor mean? Caring for the group in hiding is the cause of Mr. Crawler's pain. Remember that playwrights often tell what happens in a play in chronological order. That's the order in which events occur. An event in a drama sometimes signals what will happen next. Reread lines 692 through 705 to analyze the events in the plot. What is Peter doing? He is dressing himself very carefully, brushes his coat and puts it on, preparing himself meticulously. What is Anne doing? She is also dressing carefully. Which detail shows that Anne wants her appearance to be just right? She tries various ways of dressing her hair. What do the events in these stage directions suggest will happen next? Peter and Anne will visit together. Let's look at the character traits revealed through this section of dialogue between Anne and Margot. Reread lines 792 through 832. What parts of the dialogue show that Margot is an understanding daughter? Pause while you think. She realizes that Mrs. Frank is bothered by Mrs. Von Dawn's comments and that her gentle nature makes it difficult for her to speak up. What statements by Anne show that she is a caring sister? She is concerned that Margot may be jealous of her relationship with Peter. She invites Margot to join them. In a play, a character's tone is the attitude he or she expresses toward a subject or another character. The speaker's choice of words influences the tone. Reread lines 854 through 868 to determine Mrs. Von Don's tone. Pause while you think. She was critical, sarcastic, arrogant. What words does Mrs. Von Don use to suggest the tone? My God, look at her. And I don't know what good it is to have a son. And do you mind? What is the impact of her tone? She makes herself sound selfish. She injects herself into what should be a tender moment between Peter and Anne. Dialogue in a play, along with the stage directions, may establish a conflict that the characters must then resolve. Reread lines 1150 through 1186. What conflict arises in this scene? Mr. Von Don steals bread from the food safe. Who reacts most strongly to the theft? Mrs. Frank and Mr. Dussel. How does this event propel the action of the plot forward? Now the characters must decide what to do about Mr. Von Don's betrayal of their trust. Let's look at the meaning and impact of language in this section of dialogue. In situational irony, the playwright contrasts what readers or characters expect with what actually exists or happens. In dramatic irony, the reader or audience knows something that a character does not know. Reread lines 1222 through 1264. What does Mrs. Frank mean when she says, "You sacrifice your child to this man"? Pause while you find that section. She is accusing Mrs. Von Don of failing to protect Peter from his father's abuse. What is ironic about Mrs. Frank's language in this section? The characters and audience expect that she will be calm and speak kindly as she always does. Instead, she surprises them by expressing great anger. Why is Mrs. Frank's statement, "He steals once, he'll steal again," an example of irony? Pause while you think. Mrs. Frank and the other characters do not know that Mr. Van Daan stole food another time. What is the impact of Mrs. Frank's anger? She is forcing a decision about a possible change in their living arrangement. Remember that a character's traits or qualities can be revealed through his or her speech and actions. Reread lines 1306 through 1310 to draw conclusions about Mr. Frank. What do Mr. Frank's words reveal about him? Pause while you think. Even in the midst of an intense conflict, he still tries to be a peacemaker. What do his actions reveal? The way he is holding his head shows that even the usually steady and hopeful Mr. Frank is feeling discouraged. The audio file for this page is missing, so I will read it to you without voices. I beg you, don't let her see a thing like this. On, Peter, Mrs. Von Don, Mr. Von Don, myself. Stop it! Stop it! Mr. Frank, Margot, on, Peter, Mrs. Von Don, Mr. Von Don, myself, Mrs. Frank. You're keeping the big ones for yourself. All the big ones. Look at the size of that. And that. Dussel continues on with his dividing. Peter, with his shirt and trousers on, comes from his room. Stop it! Stop it! We hear Miep's excited voice speaking to Mr. Frank below. Mr. Frank, the most wonderful news. The invasion has begun. Go on, tell them, tell them. Miep comes running up the steps ahead of Mr. Frank. She has a man's raincoat on over her nightclothes and a bunch of orange-colored flowers in her hand. Did you hear that, everybody? Did you hear what I said? The invasion has begun. The invasion! They all stare at Miep, unable to grasp what she is telling them. Peter is the first to recover his wits. Where? When? When, Miep? It began early this morning. As she talks on, the realization of what she has said begins to dawn on them. Everyone goes crazy. A wild demonstration takes place. Mrs. Frank hugs Mr. Von Don. Oh, Mr. Von Don, did you hear that? Dussel embraces Mrs. Von Don. Peter grabs a frying pan and parades around the room, beating on it, singing the Dutch national anthem. Anne and Margot follow him, singing, weaving in and out among the excited grown-ups. Margot breaks away to take the flowers from Miep and distribute them to everyone. While this pandemonium is going on, Mrs. Frank tries to make herself heard above the excitement. How do you know? The radio. The BBC. They said they landed on the coast of Normandy. The British? British, Americans, French, Dutch, Poles, Norwegians, all of them. More than 4,000 ships. Churchill spoke, and General Eisenhower. D-Day, they call it. Thank God it's come. At last. Let's think about the significance of D-Day and its impact on the plot. Reread lines 1408 through 1450. Why do the residents of the annex go crazy and have a wild demonstration? The news that the Allies have landed in Normandy, France, leads them to believe that the Nazis will soon be defeated and they will finally be free. How does the mention of D-Day help establish the chronology of events and propel the action of the story? D-Day, June 6, 1944, was a turning point in World War II, and it should be a turning point in the lives of the characters. Remember that the playwrights have organized the play in chronological order, or the order the events occurred. Reread lines 1535 through 1566. How have the playwrights used Anne's diary to structure their play? Pause while you think. Diary entries are written in chronological order by date. The playwrights used Anne's diary to present events in the order she wrote about them. What phrases and sentences in this diary entry are time clues? Pause while you find those. Maybe I'll be back in school by fall. Wednesday, the 2nd of July, 1944. Another birthday has gone by, so now I am 15.
Something has happened, Mr. Frank. For 3 days now, Meep hasn't been to see us. And today, not a man has come to work. There hasn't been a sound in the building.
Perhaps it's Sunday. We may have lost track of the days.
You, with the diary there, what day is it? I don't lose track of the days. I know exactly what day it is. It's Friday, the 4th of August. Friday, and not a man at work. He rushes back to Mr. Frank, pleading with him, almost in tears. I tell you, Mr. Crowler's dead. That's the only explanation. He's dead, and they've closed down the building, and Meep's trying to tell us. She'd never telephone us. Mr. Frank, answer that. I beg you, answer it. No. Just pick it up and listen. You don't have to speak. Just listen and see if it's Meep. For God's sake, I ask you. No. I've told you. No. I'll do nothing that might let anyone know where...
Let's look at Mr. Von Don's choice of words and their impact on the tone or feeling he portrays in this section. Reread lines 1611 and 1612. How does Mr. Von Don refer to Anne? Pause while you find that. He says, "You with the diary," instead of using her name. What tone do these words create, and what is the impact of that tone? His tone is arrogant, disrespectful, and it adds to the increasing tension in the scene. How has Mr. Van Don's attitude changed from the previous scene? He seems to have lost his brief sense of humility and remorse. at Anne's comments to Peter to determine what they reveal about her. Reread lines 1718 through 1734. What evidence of good does Anne see in the world? Pause while you think. She points out the beauty and variety of nature, Peter's dearness, and the people who have risked their own lives to protect the residents of the annex. What does this part of the dialogue reveal about Anne? She hasn't let the horrors around her destroy her hope, her loving nature, or her faith in God. Remember that the stage directions provide information about the time and place of the action in a play. Reread lines 1863 through 1872. How does the setting of scene 5 complete the structure of the play? Pause while you think. It is again the afternoon in November 1945. The play has returned to its starting point as it reaches its conclusion. What sentences show that some time has passed since that first scene? The words, "We see a great change in Mr. Frank. He is calm now, his bitterness gone."